Thanks a lot. So let's just take this crime, for example. We're into Module 3, the Lab 2 inside of Module 3. So we're really taking a crime. So we're going to make an array list of crimes, or a collection of crimes. Now all the crimes have each crime have all of these variables associated, and they each can do these things. So it behooves us to make large lists of crimes. Now it just so happens that we have what's called a crime lab inside of that, and we make a crime lab inside of itself, but usually we have that array list of crimes. And that's really typical in most algorithms, where you have a primary object and you make a big array list of that primary object, and that helps us to analyze the problem. You know, we're making an app that's all about little crimes that people have seen, and in order to manage that, we have a big array list of those crimes. And so within the crime lab, you have what's called a context. Now the context is a data structure within Android that listens for the state that the phone is in right now. And a context is not just the phone, but the app that is in right now. So is the app starting? Is it stopping? Is it getting a warning for memory? The Android context, and you can kind of get a bigger picture by going in Android context is what you can query, and you can say, okay, Android, what's the state of the application right now? What is the application doing? And you know, what's it about right now? What is it currently doing? And so within the context, what we want to do is whenever that crime lab starts up, that's the constructor for the crime lab, right? And the constructor is the first method that gets thrown the minute that we make that object. So the minute that we make a crime lab, the first thing that it does is we're going to make that array list of crimes. And that's going to be good. And we're going to keep about 100 crimes in memory whenever we start up. And you know, we can get that crime lab. And the crime lab is roughly that collection. And we say to ourselves during the design process, okay, what's a good word that refers to a large group of crimes, or a place where we can go, or we can find a lot of crimes, information on a lot of crimes. And so we say, well, call that object a crime lab. You know, this author is really creative, and he said, well, let's just call the list of crimes a crime lab. And so let's go. Let's get into that crime list activity, which we took a look at last week, where we said, look, let's create a fragment that's called the crime list, and we're going to create a big list of all the crimes. So whenever you create a new crime, it adds it to the list of crimes. And so that crime fragment is important because it will call upon the crime fragment, but it'll also call upon all the crimes that have been made. So let's go on in, let's take a look at that UI under the layout, because this week we'll be making a new crime list. And what's interesting is these kind of, what you'll see here is you'll just see one little row in this table. My airbook is slow, so you see just one little row. You think, well, that's not really a table. A table is like a scoreboard. You know, there's like a big list of stuff that's happening. Or a stock market where there's there's a big list of things that are taking place, or a spreadsheet, that's a big list. So what we've done here is we're just going to configure two labels, or text views in this case, where we're just going to take each of the crimes and we're going to put the information associated with the crime in each of the rows, right? And whether it's solved or not. You know, so that's the third, you know, checkbox. And that kind of fits in well with the data that we know about each crime. We have a crime ID, we have a title, we know when it took place, we know it was solved. So what's common amongst these three pieces of data is this will show up inside of the list fragment. And that I'll kind of keep that as a comment. So that's going to show up within the list fragment. So when we have many crimes, we're going to have many lines inside of our list item. So what we've been talking about thus far, we've been talking about array lists, and we've been talking about array lists as being big collections of objects. If you can design that object nicely, then you could make a big array list of that object, and that you can track whatever's happening with all of those crimes. And that, my friends, is the beginning of algorithms, which are big recipes. You know, the women in your life call them recipes, right? Like Thanksgiving. The algorithm to Thanksgiving is all the recipes that go into the creation, you know, of those meals. Does that make sense? So us guys, and we tend to be more guys in the room when we do programming, we say algorithms. But then all the women who created you, they're using the word recipe. It's the same thing, right? It's some repeatable strategy to get some complex cultural result. Does that make sense? And so your recipe, you know, for this app, it's going to involve this intensive use of these array lists. And the way that we visualize the array list is with the list item. And the list item is just this repeating UI where our collection becomes visible. So when I first took a look at this layout for this week, I was like, what the heck is this? Like, how am I going to teach this to my students? And really what's going to happen is you're going to see this is just one row. But what's going to happen with this row is going to keep repeating, like over and over and over and over for 100 different crimes that are going to get logged within the system. Does that make sense? So the list fragment's an excellent metaphor for the array list as a collection within Android. And so for the example that you're going to be looking at today, you're going to be taking a look at how to get the list fragment to visualize that crime lab, if you will, or that array list of crimes. So what I wanted to begin with is kind of a 12,000 foot look at it. And I didn't want to go deep into the code because I just want to stay floating above it, because everything that you're going to do today is going to fit into that rubric. But if you take a look at this new UI that we're gonna work with this today, you can see that there's really three important text areas here. One is the crime title, which is crime list item title text. Then there's a crime date, crime list item, crime date, date text view, title text view, and then whether it's solved or not, the solved checkbox. And so you can see those reappear when you get into the crime fragment, because crime date, crime solved, they all appear as we inflate the UI. And then the crime title. So we undergo the layout inflator, and then we work with the fragment crime to inflate that crime title, crime date, and crime solved. And then we talk to the M crime. And we get our M crime, which is going to be the crime that's going to be sitting inside the crime lab. And so for each one of those crimes, we're going to take out the information related to that crime, and then we're going to set the text of that text item to whatever the data is inside of that class. Now this is, to me, the challenge that we go through as we transition you guys from Java into Android. Because a lot of stuff that's happening in Android is going to be these checkboxes and these buttons and these title fields and the stuff that, you know, typify the UI. You know, the purpose of Android is to have a touchable user interface for Java. So you guys are moving from the basics of Java into making user interfaces. But I think there's still a lot of that good plain old Java that's right underneath the surface. So for example, for each of the crimes that you guys are investigating, each of those crimes has an ID, which is of type UUID, which is an abstract data type in Java, or there's a title, which is a string, or a date, which is of type date, and it's an M solved, whether that's a Boolean. And that, once we begin to show that within this table, and there's going to be many of these here, that data is going to show up inside of the get title, you know, M crime get title, M crime get date, you know, so you can see the get date and the get title and the is solved, you know, is solved. That's happening here inside a crime. And I think the bigger lesson that we're getting at here is if you want to be good at Java, just do what you did in the first kind of month of class here, where just code a really good plain old Java object that kind of refers to the various objects that you plan to describe. So, you know, if you're making a video game, make a class called character, you know, and assume that there'll be a lot of characters running around and that there should be some data associated with each of the characters. You know, the characters may have names and they may have locations. And then when it comes to the UI, assume that you're going to associate, you know, buttons and, you know, elements of the UI with the data that's going to be inside of each of those classes. mCrime here is ultimately just a crime. So as you make these, you know, these crime fragments, just understand there's going to be a crime lab that's going to be associated with that fragment. Now, just going back a little bit and reviewing, Java deals with a lot of implementation and extending, and that's a part of the object-oriented basis for Java. And Android is just Java at the end of the day, and Java is going to use these fundamental libraries. You know, so we're going to use a layout inflator and a fragment. And so when you make a class like crime fragment, it's going to extend that fragment. And so whenever you have a fragment, there's going to be a series of methods that you have to program in order to make a fragment. And whenever you have to program something, that's called an override, because the override are pieces of the fragment that you have to code in order to get a fragment. So if you want something to be a fragment, you have to override its various methods, such as onCreate view, and you make a fragment by coding onCreate view, basically. Does that sound okay? So that's the basis for extending and implementing different classes within Java. So let me get into the fragment and that's colorful. Oh, okay, that's fine. All I want to do is I want to look at the different pieces of the fragment, and Android is not allowing me to adjust its core library, which is fine by me. But I just want to take a look at the core methods, the API for the fragment, and this is what, you know, my version of Eclipse is giving me. But maybe that's not so important for this talk. What I really want to show is that for the onCreate method, you're going to want to associate that crime with whatever the crime lab has. And so you want to break up the crime lab into different crimes, one at a time. Now what's interesting here is that if you take a look at this fragment, how many user interface elements are inside of that fragment? Can you count with me? 1, 2, 3. You guys are smart, that's why you're quiet. But this fragment only has 3 pieces to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to show this fragment 100 different times. But every time we show the fragment, each of these 3 elements are going to be showing. So on create, when we create that fragment, we're going to grab a new crime from the crime lab. How do you like that? Is that freaking great? And so we're going to get the crime by its crime ID, and then we're going to make a list by crime ID. I was just recording this for YouTube, but why don't we break it up a little bit?
What? You ordered something for me? What do you want?